Story 179 of Household Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Household Tales by Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm. Translated by Margaret Hunt. Story 179. The Goose Girl at the Well. There was once upon a time a very old woman who lived with her flock of geese in a waste place among the mountains, and there had a little house. The waste was surrounded by a large forest, and every morning the old woman took her crutch and hobbled into it. There, however, the dame was quite active, more so than anyone would have thought, considering her age, and collected grass for her geese, picked all the wild fruit she could reach, and carried everything home on her back. Anyone would have thought that the heavy load would have weighed her to the ground, but she always brought it safely home. If anyone met her, she greeted him quite courteously. "Good day, dear countryman. It is a fine day. Ah, you wonder that I should drag grass about, but everyone must take his burthen on his back." Nevertheless, people did not like to meet her if they could help it, and took by preference a roundabout way. And when a father with his boys passed her, he whispered to them, "Beware of the old woman. She has claws beneath her gloves. She is a witch." One morning a handsome young man was going through the forest. The sun shone bright, the birds sang, a cool breeze crept through the leaves, and he was full of joy and gladness. He had as yet met no one, when he suddenly perceived the old witch kneeling on the ground, cutting grass with a sickle. She had already thrust a whole load into her cloth, and near it stood 2 baskets, which were filled with wild apples and pears. "But, good little mother," said he, "how canst thou carry all that away?" "I must carry it, dear sir," answered she. "Rich folks' children have no need to do such things, but with the peasant folk the saying goes, 'Don't look behind you, you will only see how crooked your back is.'" "Will you help me?" she said, as he remained standing by her. "You still have a straight back and young legs. It would be a trifle to you. Besides, my house is not so very far from here. It stands there on the heath behind the hill. How soon you would bound up thither." The young man took compassion on the old woman. "My father is certainly no peasant," replied he, "but a rich count. Nevertheless, that you may see that it is not only peasants who can carry things, I will take your bundle." "If you will try it," said she, "I shall be very glad. You will certainly have to walk for an hour, but what will that signify to you? Only you must carry the apples and pears as well." It now seemed to the young man just a little serious when he heard of an hour's walk, but the old woman would not let him off, packed the bundle on his back, and hung the 2 baskets on his arm. "See, it is quite light," said she. "No, it is not light," answered the count, and pulled a rueful face. "Verily, the bundle weighs as heavily as if it were full of cobblestones, and the apples and pears are as heavy as lead. I can scarcely breathe." He had a mind to put everything down again, but the old woman would not allow it. "Just look," said she mockingly, "the young gentleman will not carry what I, an old woman, have so often dragged along. You are ready with fine words, but when it comes to be earnest, you want to take to your heels. Why are you standing loitering there?" she continued. "Step out, no one will take the bundle off again." As long as he walked on level ground, it was still bearable, but when they came to the hill and had to climb, and the stones rolled under his feet as if they were alive, it was beyond his strength. The drops of perspiration stood on his forehead and ran, hot and cold, down his back. "Dame," said he, "I can go no farther. I want to rest a little." "Not here," answered the old woman.
When we have arrived at our journey's end, you can rest, but now you must go forward. Who knows what good it may do you?"
"Old woman, thou art becoming shameless," said the Count, and tried to throw off the bundle, but he laboured in vain. It stuck as fast to his back as if it grew there. He turned and twisted, but he could not get rid of it. The old woman laughed at this, and sprang about quite delighted on her crutch.
"Don't get angry, dear sir," said she. "You are growing as red in the face as a turkey cock. Carry your bundle patiently. I will give you a good present when we get home."
What could he do? He was obliged to submit to his fate, and crawl along patiently behind the old woman. She seemed to grow more and more nimble, and his burden still heavier. All at once she made a spring, jumped onto the bundle, and seated herself on the top of it, and however withered she might be, she was yet heavier than the stoutest country lass. The youth's knees trembled, but when he did not go on, the old woman hit him about the legs with a switch and with stinging nettles. Groaning continually, he climbed the mountain, and at length reached the old woman's house, when he was just about to drop. When the geese perceived the old woman, they flapped their wings, stretched out their necks, ran to meet her, cackling all the while. Behind the flock walked, stick in hand, an old wench, strong and big, but ugly as night.
"Good mother," she said to the old woman, "has anything happened to you? You have stayed away so long." "By no means, my dear daughter," answered she. "I have met with nothing bad, but on the contrary, with this kind gentleman who has carried my burthen for me. Only think, he even took me on his back when I was tired. The way, too, has not seemed long to us. We have been merry, and have been cracking jokes with each other all the time."
At last the old woman slid down, took the bundle off the young man's back, and the baskets from his arm, looked at him quite kindly, and said,
"Now seat yourself on the bench before the door and rest. You have fairly earned your wages, and they shall not be wanting."
Then she said to the goose girl,
"Go into the house, my dear daughter. It is not becoming for thee to be alone with a young gentleman. One must not pour oil onto the fire. He might fall in love with thee."
The Count knew not whether to laugh or to cry. Such a sweetheart as that, thought he, could not touch my heart, even if she were 30 years younger. In the meantime the old woman stroked and fondled her geese as if they were children, and then went into the house with her daughter. The youth lay down on the bench under a wild apple tree. The air was warm and mild. On all sides stretched a green meadow, which was set with cowslips, wild thyme, and 1,000 other flowers. Through the midst of it rippled a clear brook, on which the sun sparkled, and the white geese went walking backwards and forwards, or paddled in the water. "It is quite delightful here," said he, "but I am so tired that I cannot keep my eyes open. I will sleep a little, if only a gust of wind does not come and blow my legs off my body, for they are as rotten as tinder." When he had slept a little while, the old woman came and shook him till he woke up.
"Sit up," said she. "Thou canst not stay here. I have certainly treated thee hardly, still it has not cost thee thy life. Of money and land thou hast no need, so here is something else for thee."
Thereupon she thrust a little book into his hand, which was cut out of a single emerald.
"Take great care of it," she said. "It will bring thee good fortune."
The Count sprang up, and as he felt he was quite fresh, and had recovered his vigour, he thanked the old woman for her present, and set off without even once looking back at the beautiful daughter. When he was already some way off, he still heard in the distance the noisy cry of the geese. For 3 days the Count had to wander in the wilderness before he could find his way out. He then reached a large town, and as no one knew him, he was led into the royal palace, where the king and queen were sitting on their throne. The Count fell on one knee, drew the emerald book out of his pocket, and laid it at the queen's feet. She bade him rise and hand her the little book. Hardly, however, had she opened it and looked therein, than she fell as if dead to the ground. The count was seized by the king's servants, and was being led to prison, when the queen opened her eyes and ordered them to release him, and everyone was to go out, as she wished to speak with him in private. When the queen was alone, she began to weep bitterly, and said, "Oh, of what use to me are the splendors and honors with which I am surrounded? Every morning I awake in pain and sorrow. I had 3 daughters, the youngest of whom was so beautiful that the whole world looked on her as a wonder. She was as white as snow, as rosy as apple blossom, and her hair as radiant as sunbeams. When she cried, not tears fell from her eyes, but pearls and jewels only. When she was 15 years old, the king summoned all 3 sisters to come before his throne. You should have seen how all the people gazed when the youngest entered. It was just as if the sun were rising. Then the king spoke. My daughters, I know not when my last day may arrive. I will today decide what each shall receive at my death. You all love me, but the one of you who loves me best shall fare the best."
Each of them said she loved him best.
"Can you not express to me," said the king, "how much you do love me, and thus I shall see what you mean?" The eldest spoke.
"I love my father as dearly as the sweetest sugar."
The second.
"I love my father as dearly as my prettiest dress."
But the youngest was silent, and then the father said, "And thou, my dearest child, how much dost thou love me?"
"I do not know, and can compare my love with nothing."
But her father insisted that she should name something. So she said at last,
"The best food does not please me without salt. Therefore I love my father like salt."
When the king heard that, he fell into a passion and said, "Thou lovest me like salt. Thy love shall also be repaid thee with salt." Then he divided the kingdom between the 2 elder, but caused a sack of salt to be bound on the back of the youngest, and 2 servants had to lead her forth into the wild forest.
"We all begged and prayed for her," said the queen, "but the king's anger was not to be appeased. How she cried when she had to leave us! The whole road was strewn with the pearls which flowed from her eyes."
The king soon afterwards repented of his great severity, and had the whole forest searched for the poor child, but no one could find her.
"When I think that the wild beasts have devoured her, I know not how to contain myself for sorrow. Many a time I console myself with the hope that she is still alive, and may have hidden herself in a cave, or has found shelter with compassionate people. But picture to yourself when I opened your little emerald book. A pearl lay therein, of exactly the same kind as those which used to fall from my daughter's eyes, and then you can also imagine how the sight of it stirred my heart. You must tell me how you came by that pearl."
The count told her that he had received it from the old woman in the forest, who had appeared very strange to him, and must be a witch. But he had neither seen nor heard anything of the queen's child. The king and the queen resolved to seek out the old woman. They thought that where the pearl had been, they would obtain news of their daughter. The old woman was sitting in that lonely place at her spinning wheel, spinning. It was already dusk, and a log which was burning on the hearth gave a scanty light. All at once there was a noise outside. The geese were coming home from the pasture, and uttering their hoarse cries. Soon afterwards the daughter also entered, but the old woman scarcely thanked her, and only shook her head a little. The daughter sat down beside her, took her spinning wheel, and twisted the threads as nimbly as a young girl. Thus they both sat for 2 hours, and exchanged never a word. At last something rustled at the window, and 2 fiery eyes peered in. It was an old night owl, which cried, "Woo-hoo!" 3 times. The old woman looked up just a little, and then she said,
"Now, my little daughter, it's time for thee to go out and do thy work."
She rose and went out, and where did she go? Over the meadows, ever onward into the valley. At last she came to a well, with 3 old oak trees standing beside it. Meanwhile the moon had risen large and round over the mountain. and it was so light that one could have found a needle. She removed a skin which covered her face, then bent down to the well and began to wash herself. When she had finished, she dipped the skin also in the water, and then laid it on the meadow so that it should bleach in the moonlight and dry again. But how the maiden was changed! Such a change as that was never seen before. When the grey mask fell off, her golden hair broke forth like sunbeams, and spread about like a mantle over her whole form. Her eyes shone out as brightly as the stars in heaven, and her cheeks bloomed a soft red like apple blossom. But the fair maiden was sad. She sat down and wept bitterly. One tear after another forced itself out of her eyes and rolled through her long hair to the ground. There she sat, and would have remained sitting a long time, if there had not been a rustling and cracking in the boughs of the neighboring tree. She sprang up like a roe which has been overtaken by the shot of the hunter. Just then the moon was obscured by a dark cloud, and in an instant the maiden had put on the old skin and vanished, like a light blown out by the wind. She ran back home, trembling like an aspen leaf. The old woman was standing on the threshold, and the girl was about to relate what had befallen her. But the old woman laughed kindly and said, "I already know all." She led her into the room and lighted a new log. She did not, however, sit down to her spinning again, but fetched a broom and began to sweep and scour.
"All must be clean and sweet," she said to the girl.
"But, mother," said the maiden, "why do you begin to work at so late an hour? What do you expect?"
"Dost thou know what time it is?" asked the old woman.
"Not yet midnight," answered the maiden, "but already past 11 o'clock."
"Dost thou not remember," continued the old woman, "that it is 3 years to-day since thou camest to me? Thy time is up. We can no longer remain together."
The girl was terrified, and said,
"Alas, dear mother, will you cast me off? Where shall I go? I have no friends and no home to which I can go. I have always done as you bade me, and you have always been satisfied with me. Do not send me away."
The old woman would not tell the maiden what lay before her.
"My stay here is over," she said to her, "but when I depart, house and parlour must be clean. Therefore, do not hinder me in my work. Have no care for thyself. Thou shalt find a roof to shelter thee, and the wages which I will give thee shall also content thee."
"But tell me what is about to happen," the maiden continued to entreat.
"I tell thee again, do not hinder me in my work. Do not say a word more. Go to thy chamber, take the skin off thy face, and put on the silken gown which thou hadst on when thou camest to me, and then wait in thy chamber until I call thee."
But I must once more tell of the king and queen, who had journeyed forth with the count in order to seek out the old woman in the wilderness. The count had strayed away from them in the wood by night, and had to walk onwards alone. Next day it seemed to him that he was on the right track. He still went forward until darkness came on. Then he climbed a tree, intending to pass the night there, for he feared that he might lose his way. When the moon illumined the surrounding country, he perceived a figure coming down the mountain. She had no stick in her hand, but yet he could see that it was the goose girl, whom he had seen before in the house of the old woman. "Ho, ho!" cried he. "There she comes, and if I once get hold of one of the witches, the other shall not escape me." But how astonished he was when she went to the well, took off the skin and washed herself, when her golden hair fell down all about her, and she was more beautiful than any one whom he had ever seen in the whole world. He hardly dared to breathe, but stretched his head as far forward through the leaves as he dared, and stared at her. Either he bent over too far, or whatever the case might be, the bough suddenly cracked, and that very moment the maiden slipped into the skin, sprang away like a roe, and as soon as the moon was suddenly covered, disappeared from his eyes. Hardly had she disappeared before the count descended from the tree, and hastened after her with nimble steps. He had not been gone long before he saw in the twilight two figures coming over the meadow. It was the king and queen, who had perceived from a distance the light shining in the old woman's little house, and were going to it. The count told them what wonderful things he had seen by the well, and they did not doubt that it had been their lost daughter. They walked onwards full of joy, and soon came to the little house. The geese were sitting all round it, and had thrust their heads under their wings and were sleeping, and not one of them moved. The king and queen looked in at the window. The old woman was sitting there, quite quietly spinning, nodding her head and never looking around. The room was perfectly clean, as if the little mist men who carry no dust on their feet lived there. Their daughter, however, they did not see. They gazed at all this for a long time. At last they took heart and knocked softly at the window. The old woman appeared to have been expecting them. She rose and called out quite kindly, "Come in. I know you already." When they had entered the room, the old woman said, "You might have spared yourself the long walk if you had not 3 years ago unjustly driven away your child, who is so good and lovable. No harm has come to her. For 3 years she has had to tend the geese. With them she has learnt no evil, but has preserved her purity of heart. You, however, have been sufficiently punished by the misery in which you have lived." Then she went to the chamber and called, "Come out, my little daughter." Thereupon the door opened, and the princess stepped out in her silken garments, with her golden hair and her shining eyes, and it was as if an angel from heaven had entered. She went up to her father and mother, fell on their necks, and kissed them. There was no help for it. They all had to weep for joy. The young count stood near them, and when she perceived him, she became as red in the face as a moss rose. She herself did not know why. The king said, "My dear child, I have given away my kingdom. What shall I give thee?" "She needs nothing," said the old woman. "I give her the tears that she has wept on your account. They are precious pearls, finer than those that are found in the sea, and worth more than your whole kingdom. And I give her my little house as payment for her services." When the old woman had said that, she disappeared from their sight. The walls rattled a little, and when the king and queen looked around, the little house had changed into a splendid palace. A royal table had been spread, and the servants were running hither and thither. The story goes still further, but my grandmother, who related it to me, had partly lost her memory and had forgotten the rest. I shall always believe that the beautiful princess married the count, and that they remained together in the palace, and lived there in all happiness so long as God willed it. Whether the snow-white geese, which were kept near the little hut, were verily young maidens, no one need take offence, whom the old woman had taken under her protection, and whether they now received their human form again, and stayed as handmaids to the young queen, I do not exactly know, but I suspect it. This much is certain, that the old woman was no witch, as people thought, but a wise woman who meant well. Very likely it was she who, at the princess's birth, gave her the gift of weeping pearls instead of tears. That does not happen nowadays, or else the poor would soon become rich. End of story 179.
Story number 180 of Household Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by April 6090, California, United States of America. Household Tales by Jacob and William Grimm. Translated by Margaret Hunt. Eve's Various Children. When Adam and Eve were driven out of paradise, they were compelled to build a house for themselves on an unfruitful ground, and eat their bread in the sweat of their brow. Adam dug up the land, and Eve span. Every year Eve brought a child into the world, but the children were unlike each other, some pretty and some ugly. After a considerable time had gone by, God sent an angel to them to announce that he was coming to inspect their household. Eve, delighted that the Lord should be so gracious, cleaned her house diligently, decked it with flowers, and strewed reeds on the floor. Then she brought in her children, but only the beautiful ones. She washed and bathed them, combed their hair, put clean raiment on them, and cautioned them to conduct themselves decorously and modestly in the presence of the Lord. They were to bow down before him civilly, hold out their hands, to answer his questions modestly and sensibly. The ugly children were, however, not to let themselves be seen. One hid himself beneath the hay, another under the roof, a third in the straw, the fourth in the stove, the fifth in the cellar, the sixth under a tub, the seventh beneath the wine cask, the eighth under an old fur cloak, the ninth and 10th beneath the cloth out of which she always made their clothes, and the 11th and 12th under the leather out of which she cut their shoes. She had scarcely got ready before there was a knock at the house door. Adam looked through a chink, and saw that it was the Lord. Adam opened the door respectfully, and the Heavenly Father entered. There in a row stood the pretty children, and bowed before him, held out their hands, and knelt down. The Lord, however, began to bless them, laid his hands on the first, and said, "Thou shalt be a powerful king," and to the second, "Thou a prince," to the third, "Thou a count," to the fourth, "Thou a knight," to the fifth, "Thou a nobleman," to the sixth, "Thou a burgher," to the seventh, "Thou a merchant," to the eighth, "Thou a learned man." He bestowed upon them all his richest blessings. When Eve saw that the Lord was so mild and gracious, she thought, "I will bring hither my ill-favored children also. It may be that he will bestow his blessing on them likewise." So she ran and brought them out of the hay, the straw, the stove, and wherever else she had concealed them. Then came the whole coarse, dirty, shabby, sooty band. The Lord smiled, looked at them, and said, "I will bless thee also." He laid his hands on the first, and said to him, "Thou shalt be a peasant." To the second, "Thou a fisherman." To the third, "Thou a smith." To the fourth, "Thou a tanner." To the fifth, "Thou a weaver." To the sixth, "Thou a shoemaker." To the seventh, "Thou a tailor." To the eighth, "Thou a potter." To the ninth, "Thou a wagoner." To the 10th, "Thou a sailor." To the 11th, "Thou an errand boy." To the 12th, "Thou a scullion all the days of thy life." When Eve had heard all this, she said, "Lord, how unequally thou dividest thy gifts! After all, they are all of them my children, whom I have brought into the world. Thy favors should be given to all alike." But God answered, "Eve, dost thou not understand? It is right and necessary, and the entire world should be supplied from thy children. If they were all princes and lords, who would grow corn, thresh it, grind and bake it? Who would be blacksmiths, weavers, carpenters, masons, laborers, tailors, and seamstresses? Each shall have his own place, so that one shall support the other, and all shall be fed like the limbs of one body." Then Eve answered, "Ah, Lord, forgive me, I was too quick in speaking to thee. Have thy divine will with my children." End of story number 180.
Story 181 of Household Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Kurt from Tucson, Arizona. Household Tales by Jakob and Wilhelm Grimm, and translated by Margaret Hunt. The Nix of the Mill Pond. There was once upon a time a miller who lived with his wife in great contentment. They had money and land, and their prosperity increased year by year more and more. But ill luck comes like a thief in the night. As their wealth had increased, so did it again decrease year by year, and at last the miller could hardly call the mill in which he lived his own. He was in great distress, and when he lay down after his day's work found no rest, but tossed about in his bed full of care. One morning he rose before daybreak, and went out into the open air, thinking that perhaps there his heart might become lighter. As he was stepping over the mill dam, the first sunbeam was just breaking forth, and he heard a rippling sound in the pond. He turned round and perceived a beautiful woman rising slowly out of the water. Her long hair, which she was holding off her shoulders with her soft hands, fell down on both sides and covered her white body. He soon saw that she was the nix of the mill pond, and in his fright did not know whether he should run away or stay where he was. But the nix made her sweet voice heard, called him by name, and asked him why he was so sad. The miller was at first struck dumb, but when he heard her speak so kindly, he took heart and told her how he had formerly lived in wealth and happiness, but that now he was so poor that he did not know what to do. "Be easy," answered the nix. "I will make thee richer and happier than thou hast ever been before. Only thou must promise to give me the young thing which has just been born in thy house." "What else can that be," thought the miller, "but a young puppy or kitten?" And he promised her what she desired. The nix descended into the water again, and he hurried back to his mill, consoled and in good spirits. He had not yet reached it, when the maidservant came out of the house and cried to him to rejoice, for his wife had given birth to a little boy. The miller stood as if struck by lightning. He saw very well that the cunning nix had been aware of it, and had cheated him. Hanging his head, he went up to his wife's bedside, and when she said, "Why dost thou not rejoice over the fine boy?" he told her what had befallen him, and what kind of promise he had given to the nix. "Of what use to me are riches and prosperity," he added, "if I am to lose my child? But what can I do?" Even the relations who had come thither to wish them joy did not know what to say. In the meantime prosperity again returned to the miller's house. All that he undertook succeeded. It was as if presses and coffers filled themselves of their own accord, and as if money multiplied nightly in the cupboards. It was not long before his wealth was greater than it had ever been before. But he could not rejoice over it untroubled, for the bargain which he had made with the nix tormented his soul. Whenever he passed the mill pond, he feared she might ascend and remind him of his debt. He never let the boy himself go near the water. "Beware," he said to him, "if thou dost but touch the water, a hand will rise, seize thee, and draw thee down." But as year after year went by, and the nix did not show herself again, the miller began to feel at ease. The boy grew up to be a youth, and was apprenticed to a huntsman. When he had learnt everything, and had become an excellent huntsman, the lord of the village took him into his service. In the village lived a beautiful and true-hearted maiden, who pleased the huntsman, and when his master perceived that, he gave him a little house. The two were married, lived peacefully and happily, and loved each other with all their hearts. One day the huntsman was chasing a roe, and when the animal turned aside from the forest into the open country, he pursued it and at last shot it. He did not notice that he was now in the neighborhood of the dangerous mill pond, and went, after he had disemboweled the stag, to the water in order to wash his blood-stained hands. Scarcely, however, had he dipped them in, than the nix ascended, smilingly wound her dripping arms around him, and drew him quickly down under the waves, which closed over him. When it was evening, and the huntsman did not return home, his wife became alarmed. She went out to seek him, and as he had often told her that he had to be on his guard against the snares of the nix, and dared not venture into the neighborhood of the mill pond, she already suspected what had happened. She hastened to the water, and when she found his hunting pouch lying on the shore, she could no longer have any doubt of the misfortune. Lamenting her sorrow and wringing her hands, she called on her beloved by name, but in vain. She hurried across to the other side of the pond, and called him anew. She reviled the nix with harsh words, but no answer followed. The surface of the water remained calm. Only the crescent moon stared steadily back at her. The poor woman did not leave the pond. With hasty steps she paced round and round it, without resting a moment, sometimes in silence, sometimes uttering a loud cry, and sometimes softly sobbing. At last her strength came to an end. She sank down to the ground and fell into a heavy sleep. Presently a dream took possession of her. She was anxiously climbing upwards between great masses of rock. Thorns and briars caught her feet, and the rain beat her in her face, and the wind tossed her long hair about. When she had reached the summit, quite a different sight presented itself to her. The sky was blue, the air soft, the ground sloped gently downwards, and on a green meadow gay with flowers of every colour stood a pretty cottage. She went up to it and opened the door. There sat an old woman with white hair, who beckoned to her kindly. At that very moment the poor woman awoke. Day had already dawned, and she at once resolved to act in accordance with her dream. She laboriously climbed the mountain. Everything was exactly as she had seen it in the night. The old woman received her kindly, and pointed out a chair on which she might sit. "Thou must have met with a misfortune," she said, "since thou hast sought out my lonely cottage." With tears the woman related what had befallen her. "Be comforted," said the old woman, "I will help thee. Here is a golden comb for thee. Tarry till the full moon has risen, then go to the mill pond, seat thyself on the shore, and comb thy long black hair with this comb. When thou hast done, lay it down on the bank, and thou wilt see what will happen." The woman returned home, but the time till the full moon came passed slowly. At last the shining disk appeared in the heavens. Then she went out to the mill pond, sat down, and combed her long black hair with the golden comb. And when she had finished, she laid it down at the water's edge. It was not long before there was a movement in the depths. A wave rose, rolled to the shore, and bore the comb away with it. In not more than the time necessary for the comb to sink to the bottom, the surface of the water parted, and the head of the huntsman arose. He did not speak, but looked at his wife with sorrowful glances. At the same instant, a second wave came rushing up and covered the man's head. All had vanished. The mill pond lay peacefully as before, and nothing but the face of the full moon shone on it. Full of sorrow, the woman went back, but again the dream showed her the cottage of the old woman. Next morning she again set out and complained of her woes to the wise woman. The old woman gave her a golden flute, and said, "Tarry till the full moon comes again, then take this flute, play a beautiful air on it, and when thou hast finished, lay it on the sand. Then thou wilt see what will happen." The wife did as the old woman told her. No sooner was the flute lying on the sand than there was a stirring in the depths, and a wave rushed up and bore the flute away with it. Immediately afterwards the water parted, and not only the head of the man, but half of his body also arose. He stretched out his arms longingly towards her, but a second wave came up, covered him, and drew him down again. "Alas, what does it profit me," said the unhappy woman, "that I should see my beloved only to lose him again?" Despair filled her heart anew, but the dream led her a third time to the house of the old woman. She set out, and the wise woman gave her a golden spinning wheel, consoled her, and said, "All is not yet fulfilled. Tarry until the time of the full moon, then take the spinning wheel, seat thyself on the shore, and spin the spool full, and when thou hast done that, place the spinning wheel near the water, and thou wilt see what will happen." The woman obeyed all she said exactly. As soon as the full moon showed itself, she carried the golden spinning wheel to the shore, and span industriously until the flax came to an end, and the spool was quite filled with the threads. No sooner was the wheel standing on the shore than there was a more violent movement than before in the depths of the pond, and a mighty wave rushed up and bore the wheel away with it. Immediately the head and the whole body of the man rose into the air in a waterspout. He quickly sprang to the shore, caught his wife by the hand, and fled. But they had scarcely gone a very little distance when the whole pond rose with a frightful roar and streamed out over the open country. The fugitives already saw death before their eyes when the woman in her terror implored the help of the old woman, and in an instant they were transformed, she into a toad, he into a frog. The flood which had overtaken them could not destroy them, but it tore them apart and carried them far away. When the water had dispersed and they both touched dry land again, they regained their human form, but neither knew where the other was. They found themselves among strange people who did not know their native land. High mountains and deep valleys lay between them. In order to keep themselves alive, they were both obliged to tend sheep. For many long years they drove their flocks through field and forest and were full of sorrow and longing. When spring had once more broken forth on the earth, they both went out one day with their flocks, and as chance would have it, they drew near each other. They met in a valley, but did not recognize each other. Yet they rejoiced that they were no longer so lonely. Henceforth they each day drove their flocks to the same place. They did not speak much, but they felt comforted. One evening, when the full moon was shining in the sky and the sheep were already at rest, the shepherd pulled the flute out of his pocket and played on it a beautiful but sorrowful air. When he had finished, he saw that the shepherdess was weeping bitterly. "Why art thou weeping?" he asked. "Alas," answered she, "thus shone the full moon when I played this air on the flute for the last time, and the head of my beloved rose out of the water." He looked at her, and it seemed as if a veil fell from his eyes, and he recognized his dear wife. And when she looked at him, and the moon shone in his face, she knew him also. They embraced and kissed each other, and no one need ask if they were happy. End of story 181.
Story 182 of Household Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michael Fassio. Household Tales by Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm. Translated by Margaret Hunt. The Little Folks' Presents. A tailor and a goldsmith were traveling together, and one evening, when the sun had sunk behind the mountains, they heard the sound of distant music, which became more and more distinct. It sounded strange, but so pleasant that they forgot all their weariness and stepped quickly onwards. The moon had already risen when they reached a hill on which they saw a crowd of little men and women, who had taken each other's hands, and were whirling round in the dance with the greatest pleasure and delight. They sang to it most charmingly, and that was the music which the travellers had heard. In the midst of them sat an old man who was rather taller than the rest. He wore a party-coloured coat, and his iron-grey beard hung down over his breast. The two remained standing full of astonishment, and watched the dance. The old man made a sign that they should enter, and the little folks willingly opened their circle. The goldsmith, who had a hump, and like all hunchbacks was brave enough, stepped in. The tailor felt a little afraid at first, and held back, but when he saw how merrily all was going, he plucked up his courage and followed. The circle closed again directly, and the little folks went on singing and dancing with the wildest leaps. The old man, however, took a large knife which hung to his girdle, whetted it, and when it was sufficiently sharpened, he looked round at the strangers. They were terrified, but they had not much time for reflection, for the old man seized the goldsmith, and with the greatest speed shaved the hair of his head clean off, and then the same thing happened to the tailor. But their fear left them when, after he had finished his work, the old man clapped them both on the shoulder in a friendly manner, as much as to say, they had behaved well to let all that be done to them willingly, and without any struggle. He pointed with his finger to a heap of coals which lay at one side, and signified to the travellers by his gestures that they were to fill their pockets with them. Both of them obeyed, although they did not know of what use the coals would be to them, and then they went on their way to seek shelter for the night. When they had got into the valley, the clock of the neighbouring monastery struck 12, and the song ceased. In a moment all had vanished, and the hill lay in solitude in the moonlight. The two travellers found an inn, and covered themselves up on their straw beds with their coats, but in their weariness forgot to take the coals out of them before doing so. A heavy weight on their limbs awakened them earlier than usual. They felt in the pockets, and could not believe their eyes when they saw that they were not filled with coals, but with pure gold. Happily, too, the hair of their heads and beards was there again as thick as ever. They had now become rich folks, but the goldsmith, who, in accordance with his greedy disposition, had filled his pockets better, was as rich again as the tailor. A greedy man, even if he has much, still wishes to have more, so the goldsmith proposed to the tailor that they should wait another day, and go out again in the evening in order to bring back still greater treasures from the old man on the hill. The tailor refused, and said, "I have enough, and am content. Now I shall be a master, and marry my dear object," for so he called his sweetheart, "and I am a happy man." But he stayed another day to please him. In the evening the goldsmith hung a couple of bags over his shoulders that he might be able to stow away a great deal, and took the road to the hill. He found, as on the night before, the little folks at their singing and dancing, and the old man again shaved him clean, and signed to him to take some coal away with him. He was not slow about sticking as much into his bags as would go, went back quite delighted, and covered himself over with his coat. "Even if the gold does weigh heavily," said he, "I will gladly bear that." And at last he fell asleep with the sweet anticipation of waking in the morning an enormously rich man. When he opened his eyes, he got up in haste to examine his pockets, but how amazed he was when he drew nothing out of them but black coals, and that howsoever often he put his hands in them. "The gold I got the night before is still there for me," thought he, and went and brought it out, but how shocked he was when he saw that it likewise had again turned into coal. He smote his forehead with his dusty black hand, and then he felt that his whole head was bald and smooth, as was also the place where his beard should have been. But his misfortunes were not yet over. He now remarked for the first time that in addition to the hump on his back, a second, just as large, had grown in front on his breast. Then he recognized the punishment of his greediness, and began to weep aloud. The good tailor, who was wakened by this, comforted the unhappy fellow as well as he could, and said, "Thou hast been my comrade in my travelling time. Thou shalt stay with me, and share in my wealth." He kept his word, but the poor goldsmith was obliged to carry the two humps as long as he lived, and to cover his bald head with a cap. End of 182.
Story 183 of Household Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Household Tales by Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm. Translated by Margaret Hunt. The Giant and the Tailor. A certain tailor, who was great at boasting, but ill at doing, took it into his head to go abroad for a while and look about the world. As soon as he could manage it, he left his workshop and wandered on his way, over hill and dale, sometimes hither, sometimes thither, but ever on and on. Once, when he was out, he perceived in the blue distance a steep hill, and behind it a tower reaching to the clouds, which rose up out of a wild dark forest. "Thunder and lightning!" cried the tailor. "What is that?" And as he was strongly goaded by curiosity, he went boldly towards it. But what made the tailor open his eyes and mouth when he came near it was to see that the tower had legs, and leapt in one bound over the steep hill, and was now standing as an all-powerful giant before him. "What dost thou want here, thou tiny fly's leg?" cried the giant, with a voice as if it were thundering on every side. The tailor whimpered, "I want just to look about and see if I can earn a bit of bread for myself in this forest." "If that is what thou art after," said the giant, "thou mayest have a place with me." "If it must be, why not? What wages shall I receive?" "Thou shalt hear what wages thou shalt have every year 365 days, and when it is leap year, one more into the bargain. Does that suit thee?" "All right," replied the tailor, and thought in his own mind, "A man must cut his coat according to his cloth. I will try to get away as fast as I can." On this the giant said to him, "Go, little ragamuffin, and fetch me a jug of water." "Had I not better bring the well itself at once, and the spring too?" asked the boaster, and went with the pitcher to the water. "What! The well and the spring too?" growled the giant in his beard, for he was rather clownish and stupid, and began to be afraid. "That knave is not a fool, he has a wizard in his body. Be on thy guard, old Hans, this is no serving man for thee." When the tailor had brought the water, the giant bade him go into the forest and cut a couple of blocks of wood and bring them back. "Why not the whole forest at once, with one stroke? The whole forest, young and old, with all that is there, both rough and smooth?" asked the little tailor, and went to cut the wood. "What! The whole forest, young and old, with all that is there, both rough and smooth, and the well and its spring too?" growled the credulous giant in his beard, and was still more terrified. "The knave can do much more than bake apples, and has a wizard in his body. Be on thy guard, old Hans, this is no serving man for thee." When the tailor had brought the wood, the giant commanded him to shoot 2 or 3 wild boars for supper. "Why not rather 1,000 at one shot, and bring them all here?" inquired the ostentatious tailor. "What!" cried the timid giant in great terror. "Let me alone to-night, and lie down to rest." The giant was so terribly alarmed that he could not close an eye all night long for thinking what would be the best way to get rid of this accursed saucer of a servant. Time brings counsel. Next morning the giant and the tailor went to a marsh, round which stood a number of willow trees. Then said the giant, "Hark thee, tailor, seat thyself on one of the willow branches. I long of all things to see if thou art big enough to bend it down." All at once the tailor was sitting on it, holding his breath and making himself so heavy that the bough bent down. When, however, he was compelled to draw breath, it hurried him, for unfortunately he had not put his goose in his pocket, so high into the air that he never was seen again, and this to the great delight of the giant. If the tailor has not fallen down again, he must be hovering about in the air. End of story 183.
Story 184 of Household Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Household Tales by Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm. Translated by Margaret Hunt. The Nail. A merchant had done good business at the fair. He had sold his wares and lined his money bags with gold and silver. Then he wanted to travel homewards and be in his own house before nightfall. So he packed his trunk with the money on his horse and rode away. At noon he rested in a town, and when he wanted to go farther, the stable boy brought out his horse and said, "A nail is wanting, sir, in the shoe of its left hind foot." "Let it be wanting," answered the merchant. "The shoe will certainly stay on for the 6 miles I have still to go. I am in a hurry." In the afternoon, when he once more alighted and had his horse fed, the stable boy went into the room to him and said, "Sir, a shoe is missing from your horse's left hind foot. Shall I take him to the blacksmith?" "Let it still be wanting," answered the man. "The horse can very well hold out for the couple of miles which remain. I am in haste." He rode forth, but before long the horse began to limp. It had not limped long before it began to stumble, and it had not stumbled long before it fell down and broke its leg. The merchant was forced to leave the horse where it was, and unbuckle the trunk, take it on his back, and go home on foot. And there he did not arrive until quite late at night. "And that unlucky nail," said he to himself, "has caused all this disaster." Hasten slowly. End of story 184.
Story number 185 of Household Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Household Tales by Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm. Translated by Margaret Hunt. The Poor Boy in the Grave. There was once a poor shepherd boy whose father and mother were dead, and he was placed by the authorities in the house of a rich man, who was to feed him and bring him up. The man and his wife had, however, bad hearts, and were greedy and anxious about their riches, and vexed whenever any one put a morsel of their bread in his mouth. The poor young fellow might do what he liked, he got little to eat, but only so many blows the more. One day he had to watch a hen and her chickens, but she ran through a quickset hedge with them, and a hawk darted down instantly and carried her off through the air. The boy called, "Thief! Thief! Rascal!" with all the strength of his body. But what good did that do? The hawk did not bring its prey back again. The man heard the noise and ran to the spot, and as soon as he saw that his hen was gone, he fell in a rage, and gave the boy such a beating that he could not stir for 2 days. Then he had to take care of the chickens without the hen, but now his difficulty was greater, for one ran here and the other there. He thought he was doing a very wise thing when he tied them all together with a string, because then the hawk would not be able to steal any of them away from him. But he was very much mistaken. After 2 days, worn out with running about and hunger, he fell asleep. The bird of prey came, and seized one of the chickens, and as the others were tied fast to it, it carried them all off together, perched itself on a tree, and devoured them. The farmer was just coming home, and when he saw the misfortune, he got angry, and beat the boy so unmercifully that he was forced to lie in bed for several days. When he was on his legs again, the farmer said to him, "Thou art too stupid for me, I cannot make a herdsman of thee, thou must go as errand boy." Then he sent him to the judge, to whom he was to carry a basketful of grapes, and he gave him a letter as well. On the way, hunger and thirst tormented the unhappy boy so violently that he ate 2 of the bunches of grapes. He took the basket to the judge, but when the judge had read the letter and counted the bunches, he said, "2 clusters are wanting." The boy confessed quite honestly that, driven by hunger and thirst, he had devoured the 2 which were wanting. The judge wrote a letter to the farmer, and asked for the same number of grapes again. These also the boy had to take to him with a letter. As he again was so extremely hungry and thirsty, he could not help it, and again ate 2 bunches. But first he took the letter out of the basket, put it under a stone, and seated himself thereon in order that the letter might not see and betray him. The judge, however, again made him give an explanation about the missing bunches. "Ah," said the boy, "how have you learnt that? The letter could not know about it, for I put it under a stone before I did it." The judge could not help laughing at the boy's simplicity, and sent the man a letter wherein he cautioned him to keep the poor boy better, and not let him want for meat and drink, and also that he was to teach him what was right and what was wrong. "I will soon show thee the difference," said the hard man. "If thou wilt eat, thou must work, and if thou dost anything wrong, thou shalt be quite sufficiently taught by blows." The next day he set him a hard task. He was to chop 2 bundles of straw for food for the horses, and then the man threatened, "In 5 hours," said he, "I shall be back again, and if the straw is not cut to chaff by that time, I will beat thee until thou canst not move a limb." The farmer went with his wife, the manservant and the girl, to the yearly fair, and left nothing behind for the boy but a small bit of bread. The boy seated himself on the bench, and began to work with all his might. As he got warm over it he put his little coat off, and threw it on the straw. In his terror lest he should not get done in time, he kept constantly cutting, and in his haste, without noticing it, he chopped his little coat as well as the straw. He became aware of the misfortune too late. There was no repairing it. "Ah!" cried he, "now all is over with me. The wicked man did not threaten me for nothing. If he comes back and sees what I have done, he will kill me. Rather than that, I will take my own life." The boy had once heard the farmer's wife say, "I have a pot with poison in it under my bed." She, however, had only said that to keep away greedy people, for there was honey in it. The boy crept under the bed, brought out the pot, and ate all that was in it. "I do not know," said he. "Folks say death is bitter, but it tastes very sweet to me. It is no wonder that the farmer's wife has so often longed for death." He seated himself in a little chair and was prepared to die. But instead of becoming weaker, he felt himself strengthened by the nourishing food. "It cannot have been poison," thought he, "but the farmer once said there was a small bottle of poison for flies in the box in which he keeps his clothes. That, no doubt, will be the true poison, and bring death to me." It was, however, no poison for flies, but Hungarian wine. The boy got out the bottle and emptied it. "This death tastes sweet, too," said he, but shortly after, when the wine began to mount into his brain and stupefy him, he thought his end was drawing near. "I feel that I must die," said he. "I will go away to the churchyard and seek a grave." He staggered out, reached the churchyard, and laid himself in a newly dug grave. He lost his senses more and more. In the neighbourhood was an inn where a wedding was being kept. When he heard the music, he fancied he was already in paradise, until at length he lost all consciousness. The poor boy never awoke again. The heat of the strong wine and the cold night dew deprived him of life, and he remained in the grave in which he had laid himself. When the farmer heard the news of the boy's death, he was terrified and afraid of being brought to justice. Indeed, his distress took such a powerful hold of him that he fell fainting to the ground. His wife, who was standing on the hearth with a pan of hot fat, ran to him to help him. But the flames darted against the pan, the whole house caught fire, in a few hours it lay in ashes, and the rest of the years they had to live they passed in poverty and misery, tormented by the pangs of conscience. End of story number 185.
Story 186 of Household Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kathleen. Household Tales by Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm. Translated by Margaret Hunt. The True Sweethearts. There was once on a time a girl who was young and beautiful, but she had lost her mother when she was quite a child, and her stepmother did all she could to make the girl's life wretched. Whenever this woman gave her anything to do, she worked at it indefatigably, and did everything that lay in her power. Still, she could not touch the heart of the wicked woman by that. She was never satisfied. It was never enough. The harder the girl worked, the more work was put upon her, and all that the woman thought of was how to weigh her down with still heavier burdens, and make her life still more miserable. One day she said to her, "Here are 12 pounds of feathers which thou must pick, and if they are not done this evening, thou mayest expect a good beating. Dost thou imagine thou art to idle away the whole day?" The poor girl sat down to the work, but tears ran down her cheeks as she did so, for she saw plainly enough that it was quite impossible to finish the work in one day. Whenever she had a little heap of feathers lying before her, and she sighed or smote her hands together in her anguish, they flew away, and she had to pick them out again, and begin her work anew. Then she put her elbows on the table, laid her face in her 2 hands, and cried, "Is there no one, then, on God's earth to have pity on me?" Then she heard a low voice which said, "Be comforted, my child, I have come to help thee." The maiden looked up, and an old woman was by her side. She took the girl kindly by the hand, and said, "Only tell me what is troubling thee." As she spoke so kindly, the girl told her of her miserable life, and how one burden after another was laid upon her, and she never could get to the end of the work which was given to her. "If I have not done these feathers by this evening, my stepmother will beat me. She has threatened she will, and I know she keeps her word." Her tears began to flow again, but the good old woman said, "Do not be afraid, my child, rest a while, and in the meantime I will look to thy work." The girl lay down on her bed, and soon fell asleep. The old woman seated herself at the table with the feathers, and how they did fly off the quills, which she scarcely touched with her withered hands. The 12 pounds were soon finished, and when the girl awoke, great snow-white heaps were lying, piled up, and everything in the room was neatly cleared away, but the old woman had vanished. The maiden thanked God, and sat still till evening came, when the stepmother came in and marvelled to see the work completed. "Just look, you awkward creature," said she, "what can be done when people are industrious, and why couldst thou not set about something else? There thou sittest with thy hands crossed." When she went out she said, "The creature is worth more than her salt. I must give her some work that is still harder." Next morning she called the girl, and said, "There is a spoon for thee. With that thou must empty out for me the great pond, which is beside the garden, and if it is not done by night, thou knowest what will happen." The girl took the spoon and saw that it was full of holes, but even if it had not been, she never could have emptied the pond with it. She set to work at once, knelt down by the water, into which her tears were falling, and began to empty it. But the good old woman appeared again, and when she learnt the cause of her grief, she said, "Be of good cheer, my child, go into the thicket and lie down and sleep. I will soon do thy work." As soon as the old woman was alone, she barely touched the pond, and a vapour rose up on high from the water, and mingled itself with the clouds. Gradually the pond was emptied, and when the maiden awoke before sunset and came thither, she saw nothing but the fishes, which were struggling in the mud. She went to her stepmother and showed her that the work was done. "It ought to have been done long before this," said she, and grew white with anger, but she meditated something new. On the 3rd morning she said to the girl, "Thou must build me a castle on the plain there, and it must be ready by the evening." The maiden was dismayed, and said, How can I complete such a great work?" "I will endure no opposition," screamed the stepmother. "If thou canst empty a pond with a spoon that is full of holes, thou canst build a castle too. I will take possession of it this very day, and if anything is wanting, even if it be the most trifling thing in the kitchen or cellar, thou knowest what lies before thee." She drove the girl out, and when she entered the valley, the rocks were there, piled up one above the other, and all her strength would not have enabled her even to move the very smallest of them. She sat down and wept, and still she hoped the old woman would help her. The old woman was not long in coming. She comforted her and said, "Lie down there in the shade and sleep, and I will soon build the castle for thee. If it would be a pleasure to thee, thou canst live in it thyself." When the maiden had gone away, the old woman touched the grey rocks. They began to rise, and immediately moved together as if giants had built the walls, and on these the buildings arose, and it seemed as if countless hands were working invisibly, and placing one stone upon another. There was a dull, heavy noise from the ground. Pillars arose of their own accord on high, and placed themselves in order near each other. The tiles laid themselves in order on the roof, and when noonday came, the great weathercock was already turning itself on the summit of the tower, like a golden figure of the Virgin with fluttering garments. The inside of the castle was being finished while evening was drawing near. How the old woman managed it, I know not, but the walls of the rooms were hung with silk and velvet. Embroidered chairs were there, and richly ornamented armchairs by marble tables. Crystal chandeliers hung down from the ceilings, and mirrored themselves in the smooth pavement. Green parrots were there in gilt cages, and so were strange birds which sang most beautifully, and there was on all sides as much magnificence as if a king were going to live there. The sun was just setting when the girl awoke, and the brightness of 1,000 lights flashed in her face. She hurried to the castle, and entered by the open door. The steps were spread with red cloth, and the golden balustrade beset with flowering trees. When she saw the splendor of the apartment, she stood as if turned to stone. Who knows how long she might have stood there if she had not remembered the stepmother. "Alas," she said to herself, "if she could but be satisfied at last, and would give up making my life a misery to me." The girl went and told her that the castle was ready. "I will move into it at once," said she, and rose from her seat. When they entered the castle, she was forced to hold her hand before her eyes. The brilliancy of everything was so dazzling. "Thou seest," said she to the girl, "how easy it has been for thee to do this. I ought to have given thee something harder." She went through all the rooms, and examined every corner to see if anything was wanting or defective, but she could discover nothing. "Now we will go down below," said she, looking at the girl with malicious eyes. "The kitchen and the cellar still have to be examined, and if thou hast forgotten anything, thou shalt not escape that punishment." But the fire was burning on the hearth, and the meat was cooking in the pans. The tongs and shovel were leaning against the wall, and the shining brazen utensils all arranged in sight. Nothing was wanting, not even a coal box and water pail. "Which is the way to the cellar?" she cried. "If that is not abundantly filled, it shall go ill with thee." She herself raised up the trap door and descended, but she had hardly made 2 steps before the heavy trap door, which was only laid back, fell down. The girl heard a scream, lifted up the door very quickly to go to her aid, but she had fallen down, and the girl found her lying lifeless at the bottom. And now the magnificent castle belonged to the girl alone. She at first did not know how to reconcile herself to her good fortune. Beautiful dresses were hanging in the wardrobes. The chests were filled with gold or silver, or with pearls and jewels, and she never felt a desire that she was not able to gratify. And soon the fame of the beauty and riches of the maiden went over all the world. Wooers presented themselves daily, but none pleased her. At length the son of the king came, and he knew how to touch her heart, and she betrothed herself to him. In the garden of the castle was a lime tree, under which they were one day sitting together, when he said to her, "I will go home and obtain my father's consent to our marriage. I entreat thee to wait for me here under this lime tree. I shall be back with thee in a few hours." The maiden kissed him on his left cheek, and said, "Keep true to me, and never let anyone else kiss thee on this cheek. I will wait here under the lime tree until thou returnest." The maid stayed beneath the lime tree until sunset, but he did not return. She sat 3 days from morning till evening, waiting for him, but in vain. As he still was not there, by the 4th day, she said, "Some accident has assuredly befallen him. I will go out and seek him, and will not come back until I have found him." She packed up 3 of her most beautiful dresses, one embroidered with bright stars, the second with silver moons, the third with golden suns, tied up a handful of jewels in her handkerchief, and set out. She inquired everywhere for her betrothed, but no one had seen him. No one knew anything about him. Far and wide did she wander through the world, but she found him not. At last she hired herself to a farmer as a cowherd, and buried her dresses and jewels beneath a stone. And now she lived as a herdswoman, guarded her herd, and was very sad, and full of longing for her beloved one. She had a little calf which she taught to know her, and fed it out of her own hand. And when she said, little calf, kneel by my side, and do not forget thy shepherd maid," as the prince forgot his betrothed bride, who waited for him 'neath the lime tree's shade, the little calf knelt down, and she stroked it. And when she had lived for a couple of years alone and full of grief, a report was spread over all the land that the king's daughter was about to celebrate her marriage. The road to the town passed through the village where the maiden was living, and it came to pass that once when the maiden was driving out her herd, her bridegroom travelled by. He was sitting proudly on his horse, and never looked round. But when she saw him she recognized her beloved, and it was just as if a sharp knife had pierced her heart. "Alas," said she, "I believed him true to me, but he has forgotten me." Next day he again came along the road. When he was near her, she said to the little calf, little calf, kneel by my side, and do not forget thy shepherd maid," as the prince forgot his betrothed bride, who waited for him 'neath the lime tree's shade. When he was aware of the voice, he looked down and reined in his horse. He looked into the herd's face, and then put his hands before his eyes, as if he were trying to remember something, but he soon rode onwards and was out of sight. "Alas," said she, "he no longer knows me," and her grief was ever greater. Soon after this a great festival 3 days long was to be held at the king's court, and the whole country was invited to it. "Now will I try my last chance," thought the maiden, and when evening came she went to the stone under which she had buried her treasures. She took out the dress with the golden suns, put it on, and adorned herself with the jewels. She let down her hair, which she had concealed under a handkerchief, and it fell down as long curls about her. And thus she went into the town, and in the darkness was observed by no one. When she entered the brightly lighted hall, every one started back in amazement, but no one knew who she was. The king's son went to meet her, but he did not recognize her. He led her out to dance, and was so enchanted with her beauty, and he thought no more of the other bride. When the feast was over, she vanished in the crowd, and hastened before daybreak to the village, where she once more put on her herd's dress. Next evening she took out the dress with the silver moons, and put a half moon made of precious stones in her hair. When she appeared at the festival, all eyes were turned upon her, but the king's son hastened to meet her, and filled with love for her, danced with her alone, and no longer so much as glanced at anyone else. Before she went away, she was forced to promise him to come again to the festival on the last evening. When she appeared for the 3rd time, she wore the star dress which sparkled at every step she took, and her hair ribbon and girdle were starred with jewels. The prince had already been waiting for her for a long time, and forced his way up to her. "Do but tell who thou art," said he. "I feel just as if I had already known thee a long time. Dost thou not know what I did when you leftest me?" Then she stepped up to him, and kissed him on his left cheek, and in a moment it was as if scales fell from his eyes, and he recognized the true bride. "Come," said he to her, "here I stay no longer," gave her his hand, and led her down to the carriage. The horses hurried away to the magic castle as if the wind had been harnessed to the carriage. The illuminated windows already shone in the distance. When they drove past the lime tree, countless glowworms were swarming about it. It shook its branches, and sent forth their fragrance. On the steps flowers were blooming, and the room echoed with the song of strange birds. But in the hall the entire court was assembled, and the priest was waiting to marry the bridegroom to the true bride. End of story 186. Story 187 of Household Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kathleen. Household Tales by Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm. Translated by Margaret Hunt. The Hare and the Hedgehog. This story, my dear young folks, seems to be false, but it really is true, for my grandfather, from whom I have it, used always, when relating it, to say complacently, "It must be true, my son, or else no one could tell it to you." The story is as follows. One Sunday morning about harvest time, just as the buckwheat was in bloom, the sun was shining brightly in heaven, the east wind was blowing warmly over the stubble fields, the larks were singing in the air, the bees buzzing among the buckwheat, the people were all going in their Sunday clothes to church, and all creatures were happy, and the hedgehog was happy too. The hedgehog, however, was standing by his door with his arms akimbo, enjoying the morning breezes, and slowly trilling a little song to himself, which was neither better nor worse than the songs which hedgehogs are in the habit of singing on a blessed Sunday morning. Whilst he was thus singing half aloud to himself, it suddenly occurred to him that, while his wife was washing and drying the children, he might well take a walk into the field, and see how his turnips were going on. The turnips were, in fact, close beside his house, and he and his family were accustomed to eat them, for which reason he looked upon them as his own. No sooner said than done. The hedgehog shut the house door behind him, and took the path to the field. He had not gone very far from home, and was just turning round the sloe bush which stands there outside the field, to go up into the turnip field, when he observed the hare who had gone out on business of the same kind, namely, to visit his cabbages. When the hedgehog caught sight of the hare, he bade him a friendly good morning, but the hare, who was in his own way a distinguished gentleman, and frightfully haughty, did not return the hedgehog's greeting, but said to him, assuming at the same time a very contemptuous manner, "How do you happen to be running about here in the field so early in the morning?" "I am taking a walk," said the hedgehog. "A walk?" said the hare, with a smile. "It seems to me that you might use your legs for a better purpose." The answer made the hedgehog furiously angry, for he can bear anything but an attack on his legs, just because they are crooked by nature. So now the hedgehog said to the hare, "You seem to imagine that you can do more with your legs than I with mine." "That is just what I do think," said the hare. "That can be put to the test," said the hedgehog. "I wager that if I run a race, I will outstrip you." "That is ridiculous." "You with your short legs?" said the hare. "But for my part I am willing, if you have such a monstrous fancy for it. What shall we wager?" "A golden Louis d'Or and a bottle of brandy," said the hedgehog. "Done," said the hare. "Shake hands on it, and then we may as well come off at once." "Nay," said the hedgehog, "there is no such great hurry. I am still fasting. I will go home first, and have a little breakfast. In half an hour I will be back again at this place." Hereupon the hedgehog departed, for the hare was quite satisfied with this. On his way the hedgehog thought to himself, "The hare relies on his long legs, but I will contrive to get the better of him. He may be a great man, but he is a very silly fellow, and he shall pay for what he has said." So when the hedgehog reached home, he said to his wife, "Wife, dress thyself quickly. Thou must go out to the field with me." "What is going on, then?" said his wife. "I have made a wager with the hare, for a gold Louis d'Or and a bottle of brandy. I am to run a race with him, and thou must be present." "Good heavens, husband!" the wife now cried, "art thou not right in thy mind? Hast thou completely lost thy wits? What can make thee want to run a race with the hare?" "Hold thy tongue, woman," said the hedgehog. "That is my affair. Don't begin to discuss things which are matters for men. Be off, dress thyself, and come with me." What could the hedgehog's wife do? She was forced to obey him, whether she liked it or not. So when they had set out on their way together, the hedgehog said to his wife, "Now pay attention to what I am going to say. Look you, I will make the long field our race course. The hare shall run in one furrow, and I in another, and we will begin to run from the top. Now all that thou hast to do is to place thyself here below in the furrow, and when the hare arrives at the end of the furrow, on the other side of thee, thou must cry out to him, 'I am here already.'" Then they reached the field. and the hedgehog showed his wife her place, and then walked up the field. When he reached the top, the hare was already there. "Shall we start?" said the hare. "Certainly," said the hedgehog. Then both at once, so saying, each placed himself in his own furrow. The hare counted, once, twice, thrice, and away, and went off like a whirlwind down the field. The hedgehog, however, only ran about 3 paces, and then he stooped down in the furrow, and stayed quietly where he was. When the hare therefore arrived in full career at the lower end of the field, the hedgehog's wife met him with the cry, "I am here already!" The hare was shocked and wondered not a little. He thought no other than that it was the hedgehog himself who was calling to him, for the hedgehog's wife looked just like her husband. The hare, however, thought to himself, "That has not been done fairly," and cried, "It must be run again, let us have it again." And once more he went off like the wind in a storm, so that he seemed to fly, but the hedgehog's wife stayed quietly in her place. So when the hare reached the top of the field, the hedgehog himself cried out to him, "I am here already." The hare, however, quite beside himself with anger, cried, "It must be run again, we must have it again." "All right," answered the hedgehog, "for my part will run as often as you choose." So the hare ran 73 times more, and the hedgehog always held out against him, and every time the hare reached either the top or the bottom, either the hedgehog or his wife said, "I am here already." At the 74th time, however, the hare could no longer reach the end. In the middle of the field he fell to the ground. Blood streamed out of his mouth, and he lay dead on the spot. But the hedgehog took the louis d'or which he had won and the bottle of brandy, called his wife out of the furrow, and both went home together in great delight. And if they are not dead, they are living there still. This is how it happened that the hedgehog made the hare run races with him on the Buxtehude Heath till he died, and since that time no hare has ever had any fancy for running races with the Buxtehude hedgehog. The moral of this story, however, is, firstly, that no one, however great he may be, should permit himself to jest at any one beneath him, even if he be only a hedgehog, and secondly, it teaches that when a man marries he should take a wife in his own position, who looks just as himself looks. So, whosoever is a hedgehog, let him see to it that his wife is a hedgehog also, and so forth. End of story 187. Story 188 of Household Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kathleen. Household Tales by Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm. Translated by Margaret Hunt. The Spindle, the Shuttle, and the Needle. There was once a girl whose father and mother died while she was still a little child. All alone, in a small house at the end of the village, dwelt her godmother, who supported herself by spinning, weaving, and sewing. The old woman took the forlorn child to live with her, kept her to her work, and educated her in all that is good. When the girl was 15 years old, the old woman became ill, called the child to her bedside, and said, "Dear daughter, I feel my end drawing near. I leave thee the little house, which will protect thee from wind and weather, and my spindle, shuttle, and needle, with which thou canst earn thy bread." Then she laid her hands on the girl's head, blessed her, and said, "Only preserve the love of God in thy heart, and all will go well with thee." Thereupon she closed her eyes, and when she was laid in the earth, the maiden followed the coffin, weeping bitterly, and paid her the last mark of respect. And now the maiden lived quite alone in the little house, and was industrious, and span, wove, and sewed, and the blessing of the good old woman was on all that she did. It seemed as if the flax in the room increased by its own accord, and whenever she wove a piece of cloth or carpet, or had made a shirt, she at once found a buyer who paid her amply for it, so that she was in want of nothing, and even had something to share with others. About this time, the son of the king was traveling about the country, looking for a bride. He was not to choose a poor one, and did not want to have a rich one. So he said, "She shall be my wife, who is the poorest, and at the same time the richest." When he came to the village where the maiden dwelt, he inquired, as he did wherever he went, who was the richest and also the poorest in the place. They first named the richest, the poorest they said, was the girl who lived in the small house quite at the end of the village. The rich girl was sitting in all her splendor before the door of her house, and when the prince approached her, she got up, went to meet him, and made him a low curtsy. He looked at her, said nothing, and rode on. When he came to the house of the poor girl, she was not standing at the door, but sitting in her little room. He stopped his horse, and saw through the window, on which the bright sun was shining, the girl sitting at her spinning wheel, busily spinning. She looked up, and when she saw that the prince was looking in, she blushed all over her face, let her eyes fall, and went on spinning. I do not know whether just at that moment the thread was quite even, but she went on spinning until the king's son had ridden away again. Then she went to the window, opened it, and said, "It is so warm in this room." But she still looked after him as long as she could distinguish the white feathers in his hat. Then she sat down to work again in her own room and went on with her spinning, and a saying which the old woman had often repeated when she was sitting at her work came into her mind, and she sang these words to herself: "Spindle, my spindle, haste, haste thee away, and here to my house bring the wooer, I pray." And what do you think happened? The spindle sprang out of her hand in an instant, and out of the door, and when, in her astonishment, she got up and looked after it, she saw that it was dancing out merrily into the open country, and drawing a shining golden thread after it. Before long it had entirely vanished from her sight, as she had now no spindle, and the girl took the weaver's shuttle in her hand, sat down to her loom, and began to weave. The spindle, however, danced continually onwards, and just as the thread came to an end, reached the prince. "What do I see?" he cried. "The spindle certainly wants to show me the way," turned his horse about, and rode back with the golden thread. The girl was, however, sitting at her work singing, "Shuttle, my shuttle, weave well this day, and guide the wooer to me, I pray." Immediately the shuttle sprang out of her hand and out by the door. Before the threshold, however, it began to weave a carpet which was more beautiful than the eyes of man had ever yet beheld. Lilies and roses blossomed on both sides of it, and on a golden ground in the centre green branches ascended, under which bounded hares and rabbits, stags and deers stretched their heads in between them. Brightly colored birds were sitting in the branches above. They lacked nothing but the gift of song. The shuttle leapt hither and thither, and everything seemed to grow of its own accord. As the shuttle had run away, the girl sat down to sew. She held the needle in her hand and sang, "Needle, my needle, sharp pointed and fine, prepare for a wooer this house of mine." Then the needle leapt out of her fingers and flew everywhere about the room as quick as lightning. It was just as if invisible spirits were working. They covered tables and benches with green cloth in an instant, and the chairs with velvet, and hung the windows with silken curtains. Hardly had the needle put in the last stitch than the maiden saw through the window the white feathers of the prince, whom the spindle had brought thither by the golden thread. He alighted, stepped over the carpet into the house, and when he entered the room, there stood the maiden in her poor garments, but she shone out from within like a rose surrounded by leaves. "Thou art the poorest and also the richest," said he to her. "Come with me, thou shalt be my bride." She did not speak, but she gave him her hand. Then he gave her a kiss, led her forth, lifted her on to his horse, and took her to the royal castle, where the wedding was solemnized with great rejoicings. The spindle, shuttle, and needle were preserved in the treasure chamber, and held in great honor. End of story 188. Story 189 of Household Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording the Kathleen. Household Tales by Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm. Translated by Margaret Hunt. The Peasant and the Devil. There was once on a time a far-sighted, crafty peasant whose tricks were much talked about. The best story is, however, how he once got hold of the devil, and made a fool of him. The peasant had one day been working in his field, and as twilight had set in, was making ready for the journey home, when he saw a heap of burning coals in the middle of his field, and when, full of astonishment, he went up to it, a little black devil was sitting on the live coals. "Thou dost indeed sit upon a treasure," said the peasant. "Yes, in truth," replied the devil, "on a treasure which contains more gold and silver than thou hast ever seen in thy life." "The treasure lies in my field and belongs to me," said the peasant. "It is thine," answered the devil, "if thou wilt, for 2 years, give me the half of everything thy field produces. Money I have enough of, but I have a desire for the fruits of the earth." The peasant agreed to the bargain. "In order, however, that no dispute may arise about the division," said he, "everything that is above ground shall belong to thee, and what is under the earth to me." The devil was quite satisfied with that, but the cunning peasant had sown turnips. Now when the time for harvest came, the devil appeared and wanted to take away his crop, but he found nothing but the yellow withered leaves, while the peasant, full of delight, was digging up his turnips. "Thou hast had the best of it for once," said the devil, "but the next time that won't do. What grows above ground shall be thine, and what is under it, mine." "I am willing," replied the peasant. But when the time came to sow, he did not again sow turnips, but wheat. The grain became ripe, and the peasant went into the field and cut the full stalks down to the ground. When the devil came, he found nothing but the stubble, and went away, in a fury, down into a cleft in the rocks. "That is the way to cheat the devil," said the peasant, and went and fetched away the treasure. End of story 189. Story 190 of Household Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kathleen. Household Tales by Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm. Translated by Margaret Hunt. The Crumbs on the Table. A countryman one day said to his little puppies, "Come into the parlor and enjoy yourselves, and pick up the breadcrumbs on the table. Your mistress has gone out to pay some visits." Then the little dogs said, "No, no, we will not go. If the mistress gets to know it, she will beat us." The countryman said, "She will know nothing about it. Do come. After all, she never gives you anything good." Then the little dogs again said, "Nay, nay, we must let it alone. We must not go." But the countryman let them have no peace until at last they went and got on the table and ate up the breadcrumbs with all their might. But at that very moment the mistress came and seized the stick in great haste, and beat them, and treated them very hardly. And when they were outside the house, the little dog said to the countryman, "Dost thou see?" Then the countryman laughed and said, Didn't you expect it?" So they just had to run away. End of story 190.
Story number 191 of Household Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Household Tales by Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm. Translated by Margaret Hunt. The Sea Hare. There was once upon a time a princess who, high under the battlements in her castle, had an apartment with 12 windows, which looked out in every possible direction, and when she climbed up to it and looked around her, she could inspect her whole kingdom. When she looked out of the first, her sight was more keen than that of any other human being. From the second she could see still better, from the third more distinctly still, and so it went on, until the 12th, from which she saw everything above the earth and under the earth, and nothing at all could be kept secret from her. Moreover, as she was haughty, and would be subject to no one, but wished to keep the dominion for herself alone, she caused it to be proclaimed that no one should ever be her husband who could not conceal himself from her so effectually that it should be quite impossible for her to find him. He who tried this, however, and was discovered by her, was to have his head struck off and stuck on a post. 97 posts with the heads of dead men were already standing before the castle, and no one had come forward for a long time. The princess was delighted, and thought to herself, "Now I shall be free as long as I live." Then 3 brothers appeared before her, and announced to her that they were desirous of trying their luck. The eldest believed he would be quite safe if he crept into a lime pit, but she saw him from the first window, made him come out, and had his head cut off. The second crept into the cellar of the palace, but she perceived him also from the first window, and his fate was sealed. His head was placed on the 99th post. Then the youngest came to her and entreated her to give him a day for consideration, and also to be so gracious as to overlook it if she should happen to discover him twice, but if he failed the 3rd time, he would look on his life as over. As he was so handsome, and begged so earnestly, she said, "Yes, I will grant thee that, but thou wilt not succeed." Next day he meditated for a long time how he should hide himself, but all in vain. Then he seized his gun and went out hunting. He saw a raven, took a good aim at him, and was just going to fire, when the bird cried, "Don't shoot! I will make it worth thy while not." He put his gun down, went on, and came to a lake where he surprised a large fish which had come up from the depths below to the surface of the water. When he had aimed at it, the fish cried, "Don't shoot, and I will make it worth thy while." He allowed it to dive down again, went onwards, and met a fox which was lame. He fired and missed it, and the fox cried, "You had much better come here and draw the thorn out of my foot for me." He did this, but then he wanted to kill the fox and skin it. The fox said, "Stop, and I will make it worth thy while." The youth let him go, and then, as it was evening, returned home. Next day he was to hide himself, but howsoever much he puzzled his brains over it, he did not know where. He went into the forest to the raven and said, "I let thee live on, so now tell me where I am to hide myself, so that the King's daughter shall not see me." The raven hung his head, and thought it over for a long time. At length he croaked, "I have it." He fetched an egg out of his nest, cut it into 2 parts, and shut the youth inside it, then made it whole again, and seated himself on it. When the King's daughter went to the first window she could not discover him, nor could she from the others, and she began to be uneasy, but from the 11th she saw him. She ordered the raven to be shot, and the egg to be brought and broken, and the youth was forced to come out. She said, "For once thou art excused, but if thou dost not do better than this, thou art lost." Next day he went to the lake, called the fish to him, and said, "I suffered thee to live, now tell me where to hide myself, so that the King's daughter may not see me." The fish thought for a while, and at last cried, "I have it! I will shut thee up in my stomach." He swallowed him, and went down to the bottom of the lake. The King's daughter looked through her windows, and even from the 11th did not see him, and was alarmed, but at length from the 12th she saw him. She ordered the fish to be caught and killed, and then the youth appeared. Every one can imagine what a state of mind he was in. She said, "Twice thou art forgiven, but be sure that thy head will be set on the 100th post." On the last day he went with a heavy heart into the country, and met the fox. "Thou knowest how to find all kinds of hiding places," said he. "I let thee live, now advise me where I shall hide myself so that the King's daughter shall not discover me." "That's a hard task," answered the fox, looking very thoughtful. At length he cried, "I have it," and went with him to a spring, dipped himself in it, and came out as a stall keeper in the market, and dealer in animals. The youth had to dip himself in the water also, and was changed into a small sea hare, The merchant went into the town and showed the pretty little animal, and many persons gathered together to see it. At length the King's daughter came likewise, and as she liked it very much, she bought it, and gave the merchant a good deal of money for it. Before he gave it over to her, he said to it, "When the King's daughter goes to the window, creep quickly under the braids of her hair." And now the time arrived when she was to search for him. She went to one window after another in turn, from the first to the 11th, and did not see him. When she did not see him from the 12th either, she was full of anxiety and anger, and shut it down with such violence that the glass in every window shivered into 1,000 pieces, and the whole castle shook. She went back and felt the sea hair beneath the braids of her hair. Then she seized it and threw it on the ground, exclaiming, "Away with thee! Get out of my sight!" It ran to the merchant, and both of them hurried to the spring, wherein they plunged, and received back their true forms. The youth thanked the fox, and said, "The raven and the fish are idiots compared with thee. Thou knowest the right tune to play, there is no denying that." The youth went straight to the palace. The princess was already expecting him, and accommodated herself to her destiny. The wedding was solemnized, and now he was king, and lord of all the kingdom. He never told her where he had concealed himself for the third time, and who had helped him, so she believed that he had done everything by his own skill, and she had a great respect for him, for she thought to herself, "He is able to do more than I." End of story number 191.